Hello and welcome to this Modern Criminal Law Review Plus event, an exchange on the prison and the varieties of suffering, featuring Professors Alison Liebling and Leo Zaibert from Cambridge. My name is Morten Bö. I'm a doctoral researcher at the Max Planck Institute for the Study of Crime, Security and Law in Freiburg, and it's my pleasure to serve as the moderator of this exchange on a crucial and fundamental topic today. So let me introduce our two protagonists, if I may say so. Alison Liebling is Professor of Criminology and Criminal Justice at the University of Cambridge and Director of the Institute of Criminology's Prisons Research Center. Reflecting on her path-breaking career devoted to understanding prisons, in a forthcoming book, Professor Liebling exposes the excesses of suffering and inhumanity often and perhaps increasingly found in prisons. She will engage in a genuine dialogue on the ideas and arguments in this forthcoming book with Professor Leo Zaibert, Andreas von Hirsch, Professor of Penal Theory and Ethics, also at Cambridge, and the Director of the Center for Penal Theory and Ethics. In her book, Professor Liebling engages with Professor Zaibert's work on punishment, which, as he notes, is by definition supposed to be painful and unpleasant. So we have two different perspectives engaging in a dialogue that will explore some of the problematic aspects of modern prisons and punishment. After the exchange, there will be the opportunity to ask questions and give comments in a Q&A section. So to participate, please post your questions or comments in the YouTube chat, and I will then read them out to the participants. And now, without further ado, the floor is yours, please.
Thank you, Morten. We agreed that I might start us off by explaining why Leo and I are in this interesting exchange and why we think this is a really interesting topic to discuss. So, as Morten said, I'm trying to finish a book which I'm calling my life's work book. It's trying to synthesize a lot of what I've been doing over my professional research life. And one of the things I'm trying to do is revisit some of my studies of suicides in prison and suicide prevention and bring them together with the work I've done based on conceptualizing and measuring the moral quality of prison life. And so one of the motives for taking some time out actually from empirical prisons research and thinking hard about what I've learned by all of this was partly because I've been witnessing quite a disintegration of the moral life of prisons, especially in the UK, and it was becoming excruciating to keep going back into prisons and just seeing suffering increase to do with the conditions of prisons and the population increase, lengthening sentences and so on. And so I'm trying to extract the positive learning from my lifetime in prisons research. And one of the ways in which I'm trying to do this is to see if I can use the material I have to say something sensible about what human beings need to survive. So what prisoners need to survive, but by implication, what it is about human beings that makes them either thrive and flourish or disintegrate. And so suicide has become the foundation of my empirical work on suicide. And I'm using Albert Camus' words that suicide is kind of the fundamental philosophical problem. Whether or not life is worth continuing living is the fundamental philosophical question. And I feel like I can answer that question because I've talked to people for so many years about the moment, as Camus puts it, that the mind opts for death. And I've done 3 projects where those are the conversations that I've been having with prisoners who've attempted suicide. And the answer is, from my empirical research, people don't want to go on living, prisoners don't want to go on living when the environment that they live in drops below a certain moral threshold. So in other words, if the environment is indifferent, inhumane, unfair, all of these things, the mind is more likely to opt for death. And so there's actually an item in one of the projects on suicide, which we did in 12 prisons, which is life in this prison involves a great deal of suffering. That's in a dimension we call distress. And there's a very strong relationship between a positive answer to that question and suicide rates in each prison over time. And so Leo arrives in the Institute of Criminology. I'm delighted that we have him, and we've started our ongoing conversations. And of course, his orientation to suffering, at least in theory, it starts from a very different place. That I read his book, Rethinking Punishment, and I was really intrigued and interested by it, partly because of what he says about moral remainders, that most theorists of punishment stop at the sentence, and I'm all too aware of how all the moral problems start thereafter. I'm steeped in them, if you like, in prison life. But also his view as a retributivist that there is a justification for punishment and that involves some sort of suffering. So that's where we have found ourselves. I'm trying to make him read my empirical data, and he's telling me exactly in what way he's a retributivist. So I think it's a good starting point for a conversation. And I should say that I'm trying to finish my last chapter, which is the chapter in which I engage with his work about theories of punishment from the perspective of all of this data analysis.
Well, I have found my ongoing dialogue with Alison incredibly stimulating. As both Morten and Alison have pointed out, we are both currently and for quite a while very interested in suffering from different angles, which are coming at it from different angles, which I find extraordinarily complementary and fecund and deeply illuminating, I think. So I want to talk about two topics that Alison mentioned. First of all, my interest, I think that's the second one you mentioned, Alison, my interest in suffering and in highlighting how central suffering is for understanding both what punishment is and its justification. So in terms of what punishment is, I like to use this term, suffering. I want to highlight it because I think that it is often, and really very oddly, swept under the rug. In other words, since typically, almost always, we have more than one goal in mind. By we, I mean both individuals and society. We have more than one goal in mind when we punish. Often, other goals are more important than inflicting suffering. But as a matter of definition, if we do not want to inflict suffering, we are not punishing. Punishment means doing that. And I think calling it by its name is fruitful. And that connects to the first point you mentioned. And it is fruitful because it allows me to remind ourselves as to the complexity and often the dismissed complexity of the act of justifying something. We could be justified in doing things, but they leave moral remainders. The fact that we are justified in doing X or Y or Z does not end the moral discussion of what happened. And punishment is the case I know best. So in my view, even when we are justified in punishing someone, it is typically a wrenching decision we did. And decent human beings and decent institutions would not be particularly, happy, or they better be conflicted about what just happened, even if we were justified. Now, in my reading of the classical debates regarding the justification of punishment, most theorists, whether they are retributivists or consequentialists, whatever it is that is doing the justification for them, once you have it, the discussion is over. Now, coming from this perspective that I come, Alison's work is immensely interesting to me because Alison works centrally with the paradigmatic means through which the government punishes people in many societies. And what she has seen not in theory, but in practice, what she has seen with her own eyes over her fantastic career is suffering as it is actually meted out. Now, there are many, many, many areas in which Alison and I can agree entirely concerning the excesses that the suffering that get typically inflicted in prisons exist, and they shouldn't exist. Not only the excesses in terms of the quantity, but the qualitative type of suffering. So there are deep and fascinating discussions to be had as to what exactly is the suffering that punishment is supposed to bring about. I don't have a final answer on it, but it is clear from the get-go, in my opinion, that some forms of suffering are legitimate or appropriate or promising, and others are not so, and some might be actually absolutely detrimental of whatever punishment is supposed to bring about. So I often express a certain dissatisfaction with the anti-retributivist position in general. I'm not saying this is Alison's position, but it relates to our conversation. One of the reasons why I could be so critical of contemporary criminal justice systems, or contemporary prisons, in fact, is that I could point out to all the undeserved suffering that they are meting out. If you didn't believe, if someone didn't believe in deserved suffering, in the possibility that suffering is deserved, could be deserved, then they wouldn't have this argument. Now, of course, there are many other arguments to criticize criminal justice systems and prisons. I'm not saying that this one is absolutely necessary, but this one strikes me as really important. If it is true that you could point out this system or this prison is just dishing out incredible amounts of absolutely undeserved suffering, that seems to me to be a powerful and hopefully an effective way of criticizing. This is a serious condemnation, independently of all the other ones. So, but the mere fact that the slogan has it, that the moral balance of suffering can change, is disputed by, I would say, by most penal theorists. They are, I think, under the spell of utilitarianism. Suffering is always bad. It never changes. And actually, the classical utilitarian formulation, you could tolerate it when you could tolerate punishment, that is the infliction of suffering, only instrumentally, insofar as it might then help us prevent greater suffering. But outside that calculation, there's nothing good about it. I, on the contrary, think that some form, that suffering needs to be qualified and explained, and I have devoted many years trying to, but the idea is suffering, the moral balance of suffering can change. And there are contexts in which suffering is intrinsically good. The typical one is when it is deserved, in my view.
This is what's new to me, I think, because of where I started in concern about suicides in prison, which are much higher than you would expect from the population. And over the years, I've ended up being able to work out the difference between prisons that are survivable and prisons that are not survivable. So it's not that they're randomly distributed, but that they're explicitly related to the conditions, or what I call the moral climate of a prison. And I guess I've never thought, until I had my conversations with you, I had never thought about suffering as being in any way a good thing under any circumstances. Like a good student, I read all my theories of punishment when I was starting out, and I haven't thought about them very much since. But I've been aware, as I've been writing this book, that I had to address the question of punishment and suffering by the time I got to the conclusion. And one of the reasons is because, first of all, there's these differences between prisons, which I think is interesting. So prisoners are suffering much more in some prisons than in others, which feels like unjust. But then there's the basic increase in the quantity and nature of suffering that's gone on as penal policy has changed. So I think I've been doing research during a period where, when I started, things were pretty bad. There was a little period of improvement, and now things are very seriously bad and there's more punishment going on. And what you can see is that how much, so I'm now thinking how much of this suffering that's being reported is deserved, and how do we know, and how do we make this distinction? So, for example, one of the case studies in my book is a women's prison, which went from having a very high rate of suicides to, by the end of a 2-year suicide prevention strategy, it stopped having suicides and it improved all aspects of its moral climate or performance. So the answers to the question, the life in this prison involves a great deal of suffering, went down from about 66% of prisoners agreeing with that item to about 33%. So at 33%, there were no more suicides. And I'm left thinking, this is now a survivable prison, but that 33% of women who agree that life in this prison involves a great deal of suffering, how much of that is justified by their wrongdoing? And how much of it, so there are two things that should contribute to their suffering, I guess. One is the deprivation of liberty, and the second is remorse about the offence. And when I've asked people about their reasons for attempting suicide in prison, I think about 11% mention the offence and suffering or remorse to do with the offence. All the rest is to do with prison pressures, life in this prison. So because I try to kind of conceptualize and measure things and I observe them, it feels like that your attempt to even operationalize the concept of deserved suffering and separate it from what kind of suffering is inevitable if you put people in an institution with lots of power flowing through it. It's just inconceivable that that could be real in practice.
Well, that's a sobering problem for me. But I want to say this. It is consistent for a retributivist of the sort I consider myself. And I do know other retributivists who believe that I have left the team, that I no longer can call myself a retributivist, because my retributivism allows me to be extraordinarily lenient and in a way non-punitive, and in a way to be open to alternatives. I would say flag one thing about which we have discussed considerably in the past, which is my interest in mercy. So I'll come back to that in a second, but all I want to say, just to stay directly with your point, is that, well, more or less directly, is that the amount of suffering that might be deserved not only could be very, very small, but it is conceptually possible for me to entertain the thought that prisons are fundamentally incapable of providing the type of suffering that we would want wrongdoers to experience. And notice, we have also discussed a lot about remorse and repentance. And in an ideal world, you would want wrongdoers to suffer as a result of understanding the wrongness of what they did.
Exactly.
And it might very well be the case that either prisons structurally, or at least the prisons that exist, cannot do that. I suspect it is true that they have great difficulty doing that, but it might be impossible. And that is consistent with the view that there is something valuable about some forms of suffering. And again, that in no way commits me to any particularly tough on crime agenda or to the defense of any particular institution. And I think it's quite important to say this, because the widespread reputation that retributivism has for being, super harsh and kind of insensitive and callous, it's really is a problem for the position, because the position, at least as I understand it, and while some people think I'm no longer deserving of the name retributive, I think many would accept that my position is still a form of retributivism Actually, I was called by a colleague at Cambridge. Oh, you're one of the good retributivists. And I actually don't think that this is, of course, the colleague meant well, but I don't think this is conceptually, there is no reason why the retributivist needs to say more than I'm saying. And what I'm saying is simply that the suffering's value can change depending on the context. And if we have a wrongdoer, whether within the context of the state or in any other context, who understands the wrong that she committed, and because of this understanding, she is suffering. That is good. It's good in itself. Notice, I just on that point, some philosophers sometimes like these thought experiments, and sometimes they're okay and fun, but often they are not that okay. But one option I've read is, well, what matters really is the understanding bit, not the suffering. So if you could make people understand the wrongness and not suffer, that would be great. But I actually don't like that, because I think that constitutively, to understand that you have done wrong hurts. You cannot separate the two things. Again, this says nothing about prison being the means to convey that, but
But can I say something about that? Because it's really interesting, because in my book, I compare two prisons, long-term high security prisons. One of them was very bad and brittle and made people very angry. And the other one was one of the best prisons I've been to, and it had the opposite effect. So I go into lots of detail explaining what went on in these two places. And there's less pain and suffering in the better prison. But interestingly, there was also more moral insight. So they're long-term prison. So in this better prison, people talked about their journey away from violence and their changing understanding of what they had done and their place in the kind of moral scheme of things. And although this wasn't what I was researching directly, I was researching the prisons and the moral climate, but we were there a long time, and you could see that there was something going on in that prison. And it was almost when the punishment or the suffering ceased. So Barlinnie prison, a special unit in Scotland, in a way, Jimmy Boyle, who's written books about his experience, both in Peterhead, which was a very damaging, repressive prison, and Barlinnie, which was special, they explicitly put punishment on one side and decided to run the prison without a whiff of punishment if they could. Obviously, they were still deprived of their liberty. And I think I've seen the same thing in these two prisons. So that what happened in my angry prison, or the prison that I claim was creating anger, it turned prisoners into victims who were very preoccupied with what was happening to them and were very defiant about it. Whereas in the much better prison, these are very rare and hard to find. They're getting harder to find. There was less anger and defiance and much more learning about relationships and commitments and so on. So it sort of feels like this, it's the working out, understanding wrongdoing is a really important phenomenon, but do we understand under what circumstances that's more or less likely? And it feels to me, I'm only thinking about it this way because of the conversations we've had, and I'm now looking in my data to see if I've got the evidence. But it feels to me like there was more understanding of one's wrongdoing in the prison that was trying not to punish, if that makes sense.
It does, and well, this is, in my opinion, very complicated. First of all, because it forces us to think about all the different things we want to accomplish by imprisoning people. So there might be some goals which are wholly, incapacitating ones. There are some people, regardless of any discussion of the cert, let's say, who are dangerous, and then we want, but that is completely different from the discussion of what it is that is deserved. And I think that if we assume that some prisons are being overly punitive or overly harsh and are dehumanizing and are degrading, it is extraordinarily easy to understand why whatever the suffering that we thought was deserved, was supposed to accomplish, is not going to happen because it's going to be drowned over by all these other awful things that are being done to people. But also there are things, I think, that precede prison in the following sense. If we have a criminal justice system that both over-punishes and over-criminalizes, I think that this sort of system would have so little, purchase on our moral sensibility that it would be surprising that anyone would really have the mind space to reflect on the wrong, because it would be so easy and, in fact, so justifiable for people to feel already victimized by a system that is fundamentally unfair or absurd or dysfunctional, or in which only those without connections or power or money are the ones who are ever going to face it. And so it is really very complicated. But an example, again, mercy comes back to the fore, but an example from personal relations. Sometimes when we do wrong, and I don't have any juicy story about any awful thing I've done in my life, but I did something, I don't know, wrong to a friend. Sometimes the friend's pain, disappointment, without any punitive intent whatsoever, that's enough to make, not only enough, but probably more effective, to get us to see and to understand the wrong that we did, which will be painful. That's the point, but that is the good pain, in my opinion.
But we talked about this. You have a sensibility that means you're sensitive to the feelings of your friend. I think my experience is that one of the difficulties with working with people who've committed very violent offences and are serving very long sentences is that it often takes a very long time, and not everyone goes on the journey before people understand what they've done, and that problems of empathy are all part of the sort of struggle. So you can't really conclude from your own responses. As you said, you've never done anything very badly wrong, and there's that probably says something about your own psychological makeup and character and so on. We're probably talking about a world where we can't take any of that for granted, and that there's some learning to be done. And I think that's one of the things that I got excited about in my good prison, is that I saw a process of, I would call it moral development and learning. And this was happening in people in their 40s and 50s who had never understood the impact of their violence against others. And so, it's, in a way, we have to reconcile the fields of punishment theory, empirical prisons research, and what we know about offending and violence, because it feels like all that's got to be in the picture too. We can't have a naive psychology. Let's put it that way.
I mean, but I've read chapters of your book, and as you know, I find them extraordinarily good and moving. And there is a sense in which they force the reader to come face to face with suffering as it is being experienced, and in its brutality, and in some cases its pointlessness. But again, provided that the prisons are bad and cruel and degrading, and no amount of time, as you were saying, I take the point. Of course, sometimes the sort of the suffering that comes from the understanding of the wrongness might not be very quick. It might need time. But if the prison is bad, no amount of time is going to make it happen. In fact, since it is bad, the longer this goes on, the more devastating it is on the soul of this.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, but now that I'm putting together everything I've ever learned about prisons in a way into one narrative, and I'm amazed how consistent the storyline is. I can go back, and it doesn't matter how long, it's all one story. And in another very special unit in Scotland, Shot's unit, it turns out the governor there, I evaluated that unit, and he described his role as soul development, That, you know, that's how he saw his job. And, you know, he was taking prisoners out of Peterhead, where they'd been under a blanket for 5 years in a segregation unit fighting the system. And it took them several years just to kind of come down from that. And then the process began of trying to rebuild their souls. And it feels to me, from everything that I've seen, the difference between the places that are damaging and destructive versus the places where the opposite is going on. It's such it's the difference between life and death, and it feels like it's so clear when you observe what goes on and how all these things are related to each other. So the harder we punish and the more brutally we punish, the more violence we create. I think that's what I've seen. And the two options are defiance or suicide. And that what I can now see, I've been using, as you know, one of your colleagues, Benjamin Ewing, has this really interesting concept of fair moral opportunity. And I'm using that in my last chapter to say that what I think, you know, if we have prisons, to the extent that we have them at all, they should offer a fair moral opportunity, like I think I saw in my good prison, for people to move in that kind of direction. And it feels like that's the alternative to defiance and suicide, is to create an environment in which, you know, the violence has to stop. We might have to resort to incapacitation because somebody is posing a risk to somebody else. But once we've made that decision, then there should be a fair moral opportunity to make good the harm and make progress in this kind of understanding of wrongdoing. And it just feels like we're such a long way from that.
I mean, in an ideal world, you want even more than fair moral opportunity. You want moral nudging. You want to not only to permit it, but to facilitate it, to lead to it. And again, I don't do policy. I don't know most of what I know, and I'm happy to confess to the world, is through your work that I've read, and is eye-opening to me to see how concrete you could have numbers attached to attitude. I mean, there's something there concretely happening. But again, I don't think the format is that I need to defend myself, but I just want to clarify. No. I don't think that none of that is at odds with the sort of retributivism that I don't know if this is a good time to veer into mercy, because I wanted to say something. So I find it very interesting, because I think that I'm proposing some sort of sea change in the way we approach the discussion of the justification of punishment. But this sea change is basically to go back to things that were done thousands of years ago. So when Seneca is discussing mercy, or when Anselm is discussing mercy, they are discussing punishment, and its more conspicuous moral alternative, which is mercy. Either you make someone suffer or you spare that suffering. And I think that debate is extraordinarily fundamental. And it comes to light better if we focus, again, as I try to do, on the suffering. Just as the fact that you think you are justified in making someone suffer because you think the suffering was deserved and all that, even if you're meeting out the right amount and the right type, the qualitatively right type of punishment, this will leave remainders. This is not never had to do it in my life, but if I ever had to actually make someone suffer, it would not be easy, both temperamentally, but certainly in terms of my moral self. But it's an odd counterpart. If you decide to be merciful and to spare someone the suffering that you are convinced she deserves, that could be the right thing to do. But there is also a remainder there. You have failed to bring about the good of justice. And this, I think, is an incredibly as you know, and some people in the audience might know, that's the turn my career has taken in the last few years. And I find it extraordinarily difficult to if I already found it difficult to see how to apply my retributive intuitions into the real world, my thinking of how mercy could be institutionalized is even more complicated, because mercy seems by definition to be something much more gracious. It's a gracious act. You're never under an obligation to be merciful, but clearly it is sometimes the right thing to do, and clearly it should have space within not only our moral landscape, but our, I don't know, criminal justice system, to call it somehow. But I think that it is useful to keep the issue of suffering front and center, not only for the practical concerns of all this horrid suffering that you document in your, and that you have explored in your career, but at the theoretical level. And one of the advantages just at the theoretical level is that it somehow, at least in my case, it forced me to start thinking about, well, sparing that suffering, which is mercy.
Yeah, I think it is really interesting, because in a way, us having the conversations is forcing me to be more precise about how much suffering is too much, and are there any prisons which are not inflicting this excessive amount of suffering? And I'm starting to use outcomes, violence and suicide, anything destructive, as my kind of outcome baseline. And I think I said to you that of all the prisons that we've got data for, if we look at the moral climates and then compare that with violent outcomes, we can set thresholds. So to find, what kind of moral threshold does a prison have to be at before it stops producing violence? And we've got lots of different dimensions, but one of them is humanity. And the score that you need on humanity out of 5 is 3.35. It's moral mathematics. It's not a science, this is an art, but it's helping me to say, okay, well, if only 3% of our prisons reach that standard, all the rest are doing damage, but this little number, they're managing to do something that's less damaging. And what our conversation is making me think is, could your theory, you're connecting suffering with justice. Maybe is that the only way of thinking about justice? Is that a negative version? If there's been suffering, there has to be someone else's suffering, and that sort of evens things up. Or are there more positive ways of thinking about justice? But if this is right, that we have to respond to wrongdoing by inflicting some kind of suffering, how do we restrict that suffering to an amount that is not excessive? And that I'm sort of able to play with my material from prisons to say, well, I can see places where that seems to be possible, but it's 3% of current practice, and we're heading in the wrong direction. We're sort of increasing the ratio instead of decreasing it.
I often, when I teach, I like to do a chart on the board to explain the following. So the chart is roughly, the vertical axis is the severity of the punishment, and the horizontal is the gravity of the offense. So in theory, the chart for a retributivist is a 45-degree line going upwards to infinity, in theory, but that is a very, very superficial understanding. And I don't think I know any living retributivist, at least, who would actually endorse that chart. What would happen in real life is that at some point there would be a flattening of the curve, and then there are some punishments, some severities, that we will never inflict, no matter whether they are deserved or not. Now, so there are several reasons why we might, or several factors contributing to the flattening of the curve. Some have to do with just basic human decency. There are some things we just don't do to people, even if in some sort of just really very theoretical sense, they might deserve them. And it seems to me that one possible factor, and an important one, that might explain the flattening of the curve would be that it is going to be counterproductive to whatever redeeming thing the right suffering might have had. So, by the way, sometimes it's just the desire to forgive. So there are many reasons that would explain. So, for example, when I teach these, I often do that little chart on the board to explain why I'm against the death penalty. Because I think death is above that line. Now, I haven't presented an argument as to why that is so. So here comes the disappointing bit in my intervention just now. I don't know exactly how to draw that line, but I am not only convinced, but I think that upon reflection, everyone would agree there is such a flat line. There are some punishments that are simply unimaginable that it would be right to ever inflict on anyone. And I think that your work on the soul-destroying act of life in prison might constitute, it's awful to say perfect, but good examples of reasons to flatten and to bring that flat line lower, perhaps. So
I think that what set me off down this path was an accidental return to a prison that I'd known in a previous project. So one of my favorite studies, which I carried out in a high security prison, but years and years ago, was reasonably legitimate. It was in our lower sentencing climate. And then for all sorts of reasons, I was asked to return to that prison many years later to study it again because there were so many problems in it. And I think for me, that was a sort of wake-up call. It was such a shock to be going into a prison that I had once felt, and prisoners had said, was reasonably legitimate. And they didn't talk about their sentences or the illegitimacy and moral unintelligibility of their sentences. They talked about the day-to-day, how they were finding meaning in this prison and staff-prisoner relationships. I go back 12 years later and it was completely unrecognizable. And the whole demographic had changed, the sentences were longer, and prisoners were all very convinced of their of the illegitimacy of their sentencing, of their convictions in many cases because of joint enterprise. 10 people can now be convicted of one murder and so on. And so they were really angry and wanted to talk about that. And it was really that experience that it was so destructive and devastating. It was devastating. It wasn't safe. It was creating a lot of anger. There was far more assaults going on. And it was also dangerous for staff who were retreating into their offices. And so the place was under policed, and so this experience of two different eras in our kind of criminal justice history. And I could see that we were creating damage and violence. And it really stopped. It took a lot to carry on doing research in that sort of at that time. And what I've been doing since is trying to find out whether that was exclusive to this one prison or whether there's something much more general going on. And I've been looking ever since for the kind of prison I saw the first time around. And it's getting harder and harder to find them. So I think there's something about trends over time, as well as the general sort of how you operationalize this principle, that it feels to me as if we're getting further and further away from the kind of criminal justice system in which prisoners are being helped to understand their wrongdoing. It just feels like it's all in the wrong direction. And I don't have any measurement of remorse, for example, but I might start introducing it, having met you and understood that, as well as looking at the impact on distress and suicide, I've looked at the impact on whether or not prisoners say they could become a better person, for example. I have a chance in this prison of becoming a better person, and that goes with the same trend as the other data. But I'm now wondering whether to try and build in something about remorse and to show that the more dehumanizing the prison, the less the prison is doing what we say we want it to do.
Right. And it is, I mean, kind of a little bit odd to, it is depressing to see this. It really is. It is depressing to see we have some sort of machinery just storing people in warehouses and forgetting about them and worse. So I mean, and again, this is not coming. I do believe that there is suffering could be a good when it is deserved and so on and so forth. Even then, it's in competition with other goods, including its complete repression in the case of mercy and so on. But the sort of yeah, correct. And I actually, I think in conversations before, I have quoted from a book by Hyman Gross, in which he's criticizing the criminal justice system. And I think he said, of course, prison is not supposed to be fun.
No.
But he says, but when I think about going to prison, this is the stuff of the most hellish nightmares I could imagine.
Yeah.
And that is soul destroying. And I think that's my favorite sentence in the entire book, but there is something profound about this. No, I'm not suggesting that prison should be, a resort and people should look forward to it, but it should not be the stuff of nightmares. It should not completely terrify us to the point of trembling just at the thought.
Absolutely. Yeah, and that's what Jimmy Boyle, for example, described when he went from Peterhead to Barlinnie. I think it took some time, but he describes a sort of whittling away of his own brick walls and again, I've seen this so many times, that there's an atmosphere in which people start to let go of their defenses and find, he says he eventually became socially literate. That's how he puts it. But that he had to, first of all, he had to dismantle the brick wall he built around himself. And then he had to find something that was meaningful for him. And often it's to do with art or education or music or something creative. And then he became, he says, socially literate. And that's so his accounts of his own life and how he was sort of socialized into using violence as a kid on the street in Glasgow, but how his journey changed. Like it was only towards the very end of his prison journey that he unlearned. That was what should have happened to him in prison at a much earlier stage, that he was unlearning a violence he'd learned out in the community. And inevitably, people are going to bring that into prison with them. And so the prison has to, it's either going to reinforce that and sort of inflame, or set itself up to try and do the opposite, or find the part of the person that's already been damaged and dehumanized.
Yeah, I mean, I maybe naively, maybe stubbornly, but I am convinced that there are ways of caring about justice understood as this complicated situation in which you bring it about by means of making people suffer, and not only giving the opportunity for moral, but to induce it, to really nudge people in that direction. Of course, as you pointed, there might be some people who are beyond reach. I mean, I don't want to be Pollyannish, but that's
and the opposite, actually. That I have seen some people serving very long sentences who 10 years in, 15 years in, start to work out what they've done and the impact on them. And those are always really dangerous periods for those people, that they get depressed and they have a crisis and don't always get out the other side. And there are some people who've gone through prisons who have sort of started to understand what they've done, but that can also destroy them. That it can be too strong the other way too.
Imagine, I mean, I don't want this, I have to be careful how I say it because I don't want to be perverse or callous, but imagine you had a prison in which the results about that question that you have asked concerning, do you feel there's a lot of suffering in this prison, or is the suffering the result of your understanding or something along those lines? And it was 80-something% against 11%. Imagine that there's one in which 100% of them not only say, but it could be proven somehow that all the suffering is the result of their own understanding. And that it's all a completely imaginary situation. The prison is actually conducive to that. There's nothing wrong with this prison, and still some people would commit suicide. Let's say, out of their own. Well, I mean, I think not that we would welcome it, not that we would be, but it would be a very different problem
Yeah.
from the suicide is the result
Yeah.
of the despair given the inhumanity of the conditions.
Yes. Yeah. I think I was thinking about Shad Marina's work while I was puzzling on this, because if I remember his book on desistance right, I think he said that the people who desisted from crime pulled off a really tricky psychological trick with themselves by taking full responsibility for what they'd done and for the future, but not being full of shame to the extent that they couldn't function. So, you know, this whole process of remorse and survival, and what's the right amount of remorse, when's the right time, what are the right conditions, and how do I still go on? I think that's a whole other set of questions about how you help people who are experiencing feelings of guilt and remorse through that process, so they can both be held accountable or take account of that, but still have a future, a viable life.
No, it is immensely difficult, not only for the individual undergoing the process, but for us and for society to, you know, as you know, I consider my most significant influence in my thinking Bernard Williams, whom I never met, but he had that famous example which led to his talking about something now philosophers are delighted to discuss, which is the notion of agent regret. A type of regret that is different from the spectator regret. So in his example, there's a lorry driver who runs over a child on the highway completely through no fault of his own. He did nothing wrong, a complete accident. And then he says, we are witnessing what happened. And then he somehow pulls over, he sees what happened, and he's devastated. Of course, who wouldn't? And then we would try to get him to understand that it's not his fault, that he should snap out of it. And yet, if he snaps out too easily, that's a problem. That's chilling. He needs to feel bad to some extent. I mean, feel morally bad. And his feeling morally bad is different from us witnesses of what happened. We are devastated that we saw this tragedy, but we didn't run over the child. He did. I mentioned this is not a case of wrongdoing, but it is a case that highlights the immensely complicated moral landscape of the person who realizes I've done wrong. And if it is a serious wrong, this realization could be, you know, very, very dramatic, its effects. They could include, you know, the ultimate. But as a society and as, you know, we do want the person, if it is a really serious wrong, I guess, we do want that person to feel seriously guilty. Tragic remorse is my colleague, Steve DeWitt, and in Manchester, prefers this term to agent regret. So philosophers have come up with all these slightly different forms trying to account for this complexity, which is, I think...
I as you know, I want to get you to prison. I think you theorists of punishment should come to prison and have some of these conversations with people who are serving sentences or who've been convicted. I think it feels like they'd have a lot to say, and the part of the difficulty in our two worlds is that the abstract is so hard to apply to every unique individual who you know, who has a story, and it's very difficult to find a way of smoothing out your moral remainders. I think that's the trick.
I mean, I think we may be, but I just wanted to say, this is just to expose my, what's the word, wimpiness to YouTube. But we went to a prison together last year. And I don't know if you remember when we just came out, after a few hours we were there, I said, we're out. I mean, and you know, it just being there and being out and knowing that the people with whom we spoke were still in and would be in against their will for a long time. I mean, there is a sense in which reality, there's a certain brutalism to it, and it brings you. I mean, I'm not my theory. And by the way, I felt and I was sort of affected for a few
Yeah.
days, but I am still doing
Yeah.
what we did. But there is something. And by the way, the lesson here might be an aspect of the lesson might have a very practical application, which is all these ordinary folk who are tough on crime and they think that prisoners are never getting enough. This is just, and they have never set foot in a prison. They have never, actually not even, and I mean, I did go to prisons in Venezuela, but I don't know, I was younger, I was less reflective, I don't know, but I went this time with you for a few hours and I was affected.
Of course, and that I still have those reactions that prisoners will say very often, this is a serious place we're in, and it is a very serious place. And part of the difficulty, along with our increasing sentences, we've also closed prisons down to the public and to researchers a bit, and so they're harder to penetrate. And so it feels like actually the public should be in and out of prisons all the time. That they're public institutions, and this punishment is being done in our name. So it feels like that's all part of this dialogue, that we should be having the dialogue with a very open access to an understanding of what punishment means, how it feels, what its effects are, all of those kinds of things. So this is one step maybe in that direction.
If I may chime in, I think this is like a perfect ending to this really, really interesting and engaging exchange. Thank you so much for having us listen into that exchange, which I felt was really private and engaging in a way as well, because I feel like you know each other's thinking so well at this point. There's a question in the chat, but before we come to the question, maybe I want to push you, Alison, a little bit more on your vision for prisons. So you said like you want to build this narrative on all your research you did on prisons in the past, and I think you already hinted at like a few ideas, this fair moral opportunity and giving prisoners the opportunity to understand that they did wrong. But what would that mean in practice? So do you have any policy recommendation? How should prison change in the future?
Yeah, I am thinking about all of this. And I suppose I think I've come closer to being an abolitionist in the last 3 years than at any other time in my life, because I just found what I've been witnessing excruciating, and some of the people who are serving 40-year tariffs, I think about them. I know where their families live because they've told me, and I sometimes drive past a place and think, yeah, you're worrying about your kids who are now 14 and you'll not be out of prison for another 15 years. So I think, but I'm also writing in the book about the reality of violence and how we can't be naive, that I still think we need a response to violence, and that there are times when the offences that people have committed are so serious and their understanding so poor that we just have to take them out for reasons of safety. So obviously I'm using my understanding of the really exceptional peak prisons, I call them morally exceptional prisons, and I'm describing them in as much detail as possible because I think they're a bit of a blueprint. So I would say we need to make sentencing legitimate and morally intelligible, and at the moment it isn't. So I think we need to do something quite drastic about sentencing. But then I think there's a way of describing and thinking about and designing prisons that do least harm. And so I think our very much fewer prisons, if we have them at all, should look like that. And I am doing my best to describe them and theorize about why these prisons are less damaging and more constructive. So I think it's a two-pronged vision, which would mean more meaningful punishment, I guess, closer in line. What would Leo's model of a place for deserved suffering that's not excessive, what would that look like? And I think I'm trying to supply what that might look like, I think.
Okay, perfect. Coming to the question in the YouTube chat, which I will read out. I wonder if adopting the framework of suffering leads to more moral remainders than other frameworks, as intentionally inflicting the right or proportional amount of suffering is very tricky. If so, would it be a reason to be somewhat hesitant to embrace that framework?
I'm not sure I see the worry here. I think that highlighting the reality of suffering and in fact the really paradoxical, well, I don't know, dilemmatic situation of any punishment or almost virtually any punishment, except for this sort of thought experiment in which you have just a completely evil, without any redeeming quality character who has done the most monstrous thing. Retributive justice, in the sense of the justice when it comes to giving people something in response to their wrongdoing, is dilemmatic because you create a good by means of generating a bad, to put it very bluntly. And I think if we emphasize that, it's helpful because it makes some of the delusions of our society and so on to be probably more easily identifiable. Highlighting the reality of suffering is not to recommend more suffering, or that's not at all what I have in mind. In fact, when Alison said that she's becoming closer to an abolitionist, I am not as close. However, I could conceive myself as some sort of reluctant abolitionist in the following sense. My insistence is the fact that someone deserves the suffering should not be stipulated out of existence. This has to be part of the story of the discussion. However, it could be that we have a system or a situation which has so many other problems that then it loses out completely. And I have an anecdote. In a previous job, very quickly, there was a discussion amongst faculty. We had a system for merit salary increases for the faculty. And by the way, the word merit, in many languages, we don't have two words, one for merit and one for desert. So all those desert skeptics are skeptics about the idea of merit. So that's a good thing to keep in mind. So, but many of my colleagues were against this really convoluted and unfair, it was, to the extent that was intelligible, merit system. And we had discussions, and many of my colleagues were of the view that merit is always a fabrication, is a form of domination, which is not at all my view. But I voted with them to get rid of that system. And explicitly, I say, it's not that I agree with you that merit is always corrupt or always bankrupt, but this system is, in my opinion, worse than, it doesn't make any sense. So we better be without it at all. So I think that would be somewhat analogous to perhaps out of resignation, say, listen, there is no way to inflict these inordinate amounts of undeserved suffering, so we might as well do without that. By the way, this is consistent with the cases in which we need incapacitation, and that's different. But again, my insistence is you cannot pretend, and you're actually arguing, you're choosing the wrong enemy when you're going up against the idea of deserved suffering. That is part of who we are. We apply it in our personal relations. That's human psychology, and for a good reason. But it could be that it is, in practical terms, impossible to distribute it or to inflict it without all these other awful things. And yeah, so I don't think that just trying to remind people of the reality of what we're doing. I think in the book I say the criminal justice system is in the business of making people suffer. And I find, if I could say so myself, that way of putting it sobering. I mean, this is part of what the criminal justice system is in the business of doing. And I'm not saying you should stop that business, but I mean, to put it like that, it's a good reminder of that, of the fact that that's part of what's happening, an important part.
If I can just add something, I think I started out in my research life very against suffering, and in general, I think I still feel the same way. And I wonder if I'm slightly against the word punishment too, that I wonder if that's doing it's making things more difficult, because the word punishment is impacting on what people think they're doing, what staff think they're doing when people go to prison. And so today, or in the last sort of period, as I'm starting to write my conclusion, I'm veering towards an incapacitation theory over a punishment theory. But obviously, in terms of the justification for depriving people of their liberty, there's got to be a scale. There's got to be some kind of scale. So I think I'm nervous about the words punishment and suffering, but I'm sort of intrigued to explore further whether there is any possibility of a system of deserved suffering that doesn't stray into undeserved gratuitous suffering. I guess that's the question.
Great, thank you. Yeah, again, if there are any questions in the audience, please write your questions in the chat. Otherwise, I will take the opportunity to ask a question. And when you were discussing, I think Leo mentioned the death penalty at one point, and you mentioned suicide in prison. And in my PhD, I was reading, this is like weird connotation now, but on the criminal law reform and penal theory in National Socialism. And one thing they were discussing about whether in case of a death sentence, the offender should be allowed to commit suicide instead in
this
prison.
Is so interesting.
Whether they should provide
not in the case of
for
the death penalty, but actually this is in my chapter now, that a very good PhD student, Caroline de Vink in Belgium, did her PhD on euthanasia requests in Belgium. That since euthanasia was legalized or decriminalized in about 2002, prisoners are eligible to request euthanasia, and there's supposed to be very strict criteria. So you have to have an untreatable illness, and you have to be shown to be suffering from, unbearable suffering. And as it happened, so she interviewed all the people who had requested it and found, I was partly supervising the project and was not surprised to learn that the requests were impacted by the conditions of the prison. So one of the people who requested it was moved to a special forensic unit and then withdrew his request because the conditions in which he was being held were just improved. And I've been trying to sort of bring myself up to date since she finished her PhD, and none of those 17 have been granted. But in Canada, I understand that 3 prisoners have been granted voluntary euthanasia of about 11 requests or something like that. So all the countries that have decriminalized euthanasia, and it for me, it feels a bit like a death sentence by the back door. And the fact that it's impacted by the conditions and culture of the prison, I think, make it deeply, deeply controversial. So
I think so too.
Yeah.
Leo, do you want to?
Yeah, what I wanted to say, I mean, obviously not by any stretch I want to defend National Socialism. However, there is a sense in which the idea of someone who would commit suicide out of the realization of an immense wrong that he has committed, it's more morally palatable than someone who never gets to recognize it. By the way, this in no way commits one to the death penalty, because there's a complete difference between the person doing this to herself and someone else imposing it. So in fact, the harakiri in Japanese culture is an honor. So you kill yourself. And by the way, you kill yourself in a ritual that involves a certain amount of not only pain, but a certain strength of will. And you're not, if someone comes and shots you, I mean, I'm not an expert on the topic, but my understanding is if someone comes and facilitate your success in doing this, they completely ruined it. It has to be self-generated. I'm not endorsing that either. All I'm saying is that someone may feel such an amount of guilt that the only answer, whatever the best answer that she might find to what she did is to kill herself. I'm not recommending it, but as when the discussion with Alison, that would be a wholly different story about suicide than the one that, you know, that we see in prisons, which out of complete despair, people turn to this because just life is unbearable, not out of a sense of, you know, immense guilt, just out of you know, I've been broken, completely broken. I cannot take it anymore. It's just not. So, I mean, I hope I didn't come across as defending the suicide. Not. I'm just pointing out there would be a difference. There is something redeeming about the moral monster who decides, okay, I have to kill myself given what I did, and the one who is, you know, completely impassible and, you know, indolent.
No, absolutely. I think this analogy maybe can do some work still today. My angle was a bit that if we as a society to take a strong stance against the death penalty, we should also maybe take a strong stand against conditions in prisons which contribute to people more likely to commit suicide.
Yes.
So this was my idea here. There are no more questions in the chat. I would give you the opportunity, if you want to say like your bottom line, what is maybe the most interesting thing you learned through your exchange, and otherwise I would end the session with your permission.
I think I'm very interested in continuing what I do and obviously our conversations, but in building in something about remorse and attitudes to wrongdoing and seeing if that can somehow be related to conditions in prison. So I would expect that the places where we find understanding of one's wrongdoing will be the places that are not punitive, that are providing fair moral opportunities, recognition, support, humanity, all of those things. That's my hypothesis. So I'd be quite interested in exploring that further.
Just on that point, I would just like to say that remorse seems to me to be necessarily painful. So when you are remorseful, you are suffering. That is the right. I mean, of course, I have nothing to back this up in terms of policy or concrete recommendations. But in an ideal world, well, that might be the suffering that we want the wrongdoer to experience, to feel remorse, to feel the wrongness of what she did. And when I think this is one of those examples in which suffering is not bad, it's intrinsically good, or it forms part of an organic whole that is better because of its presence. I mean, there are technicalities to be added, but I think this has to be part of the story, in my opinion. I don't know what size apart or but yeah.
Okay, thanks. Perfect. I have a few final announcements before we end the session. So to stay informed about upcoming MCLR Plus events, publication and projects, check the MCLR Plus website, and please consider signing up for the MCLR Plus mailing list. We have two special issue workshops coming up in the summer, one on rethinking criminal law, guest edited by Nicola Lacey, and the other one on criminal law and literature, guest edited by Simon Stern. All that is left to say now is thank you to you two, Professor Liebling and Professor Zaibert, for letting us join your really exceptional conversation on this topic. And I hope that somehow our two fields can come more closely together. That would be great. Thanks also to the audience for coming today and for those who participated in the discussion. And last but not least, I would like to thank Professor Markus Dubber, who is not only the mastermind behind the MCL Plus project, but also our technician behind the scenes today. Yeah, with that, thank you very much. Goodbye and see you soon at the next event. Bye-bye.